institutions like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and things like that. And when I do that, the scientists and students who listen to me are often very amazed that there's such a huge amount of evidence that they've never even heard of before, not even to be spoken of negatively. So I just tell them, all right, let's just keep the entire data set in view, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what is useful and what's not useful, but let's just keep the entire set of facts in view.
Right, and it's especially when you've got empirical evidence, but there's obviously, as you say, knowledge filtration going on when they ignore their own evidence that they themselves produce.
And I would say, I mean, just as the questioner has a perfect right to her opinion and her view, and she can question me, and I think I also have a right to my opinion and my view, and I don't think the government should be brought into it to say, oh, only your idea can be mentioned in the schools and not any other idea.
Yeah.
That's what I think is the problem.
She admitted that she was actually afraid to listen to the program tonight. She was afraid that she would agree with you too much, and then she would have to re-examine her
well, I would
beliefs.
say if she wants to. Of course, you can only say a few things on a show. I would advise the person get the book Forbidden Archeology and read it. And as you were mentioning on the show, it's been reviewed by about a dozen authors in scientific journals and professional journals of archaeology and anthropology. Now, some of them don't like the book very much. That's a fact. But as you mentioned, even they are saying, well, that we did a good job in putting this book together because nobody's really gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. For example, in Social Studies of Science, a noted historian of science, David Oldroyd, and a graduate student named Joe Wodak wrote a 23-page article about the book, and they asked a question: does this book make a contribution, a genuine contribution, to the literature on paleoanthropology? And they said yes, for two reasons. They said, as professional historians of science, they said we could think of no one who has gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before and examined all of these little-known cases, citing the original literature and going into both the pros and the cons. Because we don't just give the pros about these anomalous cases. We consider the skeptical kinds of objections that many people would like to give. And then also they said the book made a genuine contribution because it raises important questions about the nature of scientific truth claims. In other words, science gives all kinds of claims. Now, if you look at the whole history of science, you'll see that practically every scientific theory that's ever been proposed has been shown to be wrong after some time. So what about what we're being told today is the truth? Is it really correct? I don't think we can say that. So I think we have to keep an open mind about these things.
Absolutely. To quote from part of a peer-reviewed publication, it is notable that Cremo's own textual voice tends toward the measured dispassion of the established journal, except in some of his responses to internet comments where he adopts a tone of strident sarcasm used by some of his critics. There is a sense in which we are all speaking the same language. Paradoxically, however, it is this very unity that also divides. How can unity divide? Anyway, it says, Cremo's new literary form adds to the documentation of this condition, but makes no clear proposal for transcendence. And that's Simon Locke from School of Social something or another.
Yeah, but what Simon Locke was talking about was my book, Forbidden Archeology's impact. Because many people would ask me after Forbidden Archeology came out, well, what has been the reaction from the world of science to that work, to your work? So I put together this book, Forbidden Archeology's Impact, to answer that question. And what I did is I put in all the reviews of the book from all the different scientific journals that commented on it. And I put the complete reviews in there, the positive, the negative. I didn't just pick out the positive statements. I put them in, the good, the bad, the ugly. Everything is there, plus my correspondence with different scientists on these questions.
Right.
And the text of different papers that I've presented at scientific conferences on these questions. And I just put it all out there without trying to make a conclusion myself, so that researchers and interested people could look through the whole thing and draw their own conclusion about the value of the work. I think that's what Simon Locke was commenting on, that I wasn't taking all these voices and trying to synthesize them all and make a conclusion out of it. I just put all the different responses to Forbidden Archaeology, plus all my responses to the responses, and then just let people make up their own minds.
So you're not trying to put forth any kind of proposal for specific transcendence or.
Well, now in my book Forbidden Archaeology, I didn't do that. I said I'm just going to put the archaeological evidence here and let people make up their own minds about it. And as far as my interpretation of it and any ideas that I might have for some alternative theory, I'm going to save that for another book.
Yeah.
Which was that book, Human Devolution, where I do have my ideas for transcendence and alternative explanations and things like that. But in the book, Forbidden Archaeology, basically I just wanted to put the record out there, the facts.
Now, speaking of transcendence, you became involved with the Hare Krishna movement. Now, how did that lead you into where you are now? I know you're inspired by the Vedas in a lot of ways to do this research, but how did this all really begin?
Well, it began when I was in my early 20s, and I began looking around for a worldview that made more sense to me than the worldviews I was accustomed to. And that led me to studying the ancient Sanskrit writings of India under the guidance of a teacher. And there was a lot of that was just really pretty strictly personal, about my own spiritual practice of meditation, my understanding of the concept of reincarnation, my adoption of a vegetarian diet. There was a lot of personal elements to it, personal, spiritual cultivation that was taking up some of my time. But I've always been a scholar of some sort. I've always been curious about the nature of the world. So I began looking at the part of the Vedic literature that deals with the history of life on this planet, the history of human life. And that group of writings is called the Puranas. So it was in the Puranas that I saw these accounts of extreme human antiquity, the idea that humans come from some higher spiritual level of reality, and all of those kinds of ideas, which were completely different than anything I had ever heard from any of my teachers in high school or at the university. So I began to think, well, really, is there any physical evidence that would tend to support what these ancient writings are saying? So that's what got me into looking into the whole history of archaeology, looking to see if there actually was any evidence for extreme human antiquity, for example. And I found there was. I didn't invent this evidence. It's reported in the scientific literature. It's reported by original investigators in the original scientific literature of the past 150 years. So it's not that I invented this evidence. I really didn't even know if any such evidence existed. But when I looked, not just at the current textbooks, but when I looked at the original scientific literature, I found such evidence did exist. And that was I would say, something. When you're looking for something and you're finding it, it kind of drives you on to find more. Yeah, if I had looked and found nothing, I might have become discouraged.
Have you found evidence of skeletal remains that were enormous or a lot larger than humans normally are, but still basically Homo sapien type?
I have